At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. Now what do you say?" They are using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "If any one of you is without sin, let him be the first to throw a stone at her." Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who had heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." Hello, welcome to the online message of Corinth Christian Church. Several years ago, San Diego Superior Court, there was a trial going on in which two men were on trial for armed robbery. The prosecutor had an eyewitness that had seen the crime and the getaway. And so he had this eyewitness on the stand and he was being questioned, and the prosecuting attorney asked the eyewitness, said, "So you saw the two men holding a gun on the victim?" And she replied, "Yes." He goes, "And then you saw those two same men getting into a car and leaving at a high rate of speed?" And she replied, "That's correct." And then for effect, the prosecutor turned around to face the two men who were accused, and she asked the witness, "Are those two men in this courtroom?" And the two men, thinking that the attorney was asking them the question, raised their hands and said, "We're right here." Now the defense lawyer is going to have a tough time getting them off because everyone knows what they did. They admitted it. How do we handle ourselves when we've sinned and broken God's law and maybe everyone knows about it? Maybe you tried to keep it a secret but got caught, or maybe everyone knows about it because many times we flaunt the sin that we commit. We take pride in sin sometimes. We can go back and talk about, "Man, this is what I did last week. This is what I did, 2 months ago," or something to that effect. But maybe that's happened to you, and now you've got to the point where you realize you need to come back. And you're not really sure if you can. See, sometimes people think they can't really come back because they messed up and everyone knows about it. Sometimes churches don't make it easy on people because some will emphasize your sin for the rest of your life. They'll remind you you're never really good enough. After what you did, some will try to say God doesn't care how you've lived in the past, that He will never be able to forgive you. At least they act that way. And some will try to pretend that God doesn't care how you live today as long as it makes you happy. There's no real sins left other than being judgmental. Definition of judgmental today is anytime you say something that is the difference between right and wrong and that the Bible determines that difference. When you do that, they say you're being judgmental. And the issue with this is that one of those ideas emphasizes grace and the other one emphasizes law. One worships the Godfather. It's the Godfather which art in heaven, and He's looking for a reason to condemn people. He's looking for a reason to come in and send people to hell for the slightest offense, and He's taking joy in it. And then the other people are worshiping the grandfather that's in heaven. He's just a grandpa that sees no wrong and really doesn't care how you live as long as you give him a little attention once in a while. Actually, there is a very fine line between grace and the acknowledgement of sin. Sometimes it's hard to tell where that line falls. How do we make a comeback when we've sinned and everyone knows about it? In this story, this lady would tell you that she was at the lowest point in her life, that she really did need a comeback. Her story, her comeback probably had more to do with the Pharisees and their hatred towards Jesus than it did with her. Jesus is in Jerusalem for the feast, probably the Feast of Tabernacles. And while he's there, he does what he always does. He goes and he teaches in the temple. And there are large crowds coming to see him. There are people now that are starting to think he might be the one. He might be the Messiah. And the rulers, the religious rulers, they're thinking, we've got to put a stop to this. And so they determine that they're going to try to arrest him. Chapter 7, verse 30 says they can't arrest him even though they try because he won't allow it, because it says it's not his time yet. And so here we come on this day that he's already tried to been arrested before, and then they send the temple guard to try to arrest him. The temple guards go with full intentions to bring him in. But when they get to where Jesus is, they begin to listen to him speak. And they come back and they report to the religious rulers, they just couldn't do it. They said, no one's ever spoken like him. And then, to top it off, Nicodemus is taking up for Jesus. And so here are the Pharisees and the religious rulers who are upset. In fact, they're mad. They've had 2 attempts that have failed to stop Jesus, and now they have one more idea that they're going to try to do whatever they can to stop Jesus from teaching, to stop people from coming to hear him. And if everything goes according to plan, by mid-morning, they'll have Jesus where either he's ruined his credibility or he'll be in a Roman prison because he's being charged with insurrection. Now, as the Pharisees plan this, Jesus and his disciples are sleeping on Mount Olives. And they wake before dawn and they begin to walk towards the temple. They begin to go there. They want to get there maybe early because they know that there are people that are waiting there who want to know the truth about God and who he is and who the Messiah is. Some people have suggested that already Jesus can hear this woman that's going to be drugged in before him, that he can hear her cries and her screams for help, even in his heart, even before it's even happened maybe. And so he gets to the temple and he sits down to teach. And in the ancient world, the teacher would sit and the students would stand around and listen, sometimes for hours. And so he's there and he's beginning to teach when all of a sudden there's this commotion. You can hear it off in the distance, this scuffling that's going on. This woman that's pleading, no, please, please don't. Please let me go. And here are these scribes and Pharisees that are dragging this half-dressed, maybe not dressed at all woman. They're dragging her through the temple court towards Jesus. She's trying to free herself. She's struggling. And these men are forcing her through the crowd. And they interrupt Jesus' teaching. They grab the attention of the crowd here that have been listening. They can't help but get their attention. It's not something you see every day in the temple. I mean, in fact, you probably don't ever see it in the temple. And so here they come in with this woman and they force her to stand before Jesus. And you can imagine the crowd just surges. They all want to gather around to see what's going on. They know that there's something happening here. And these men say, Rabbi, we caught this woman in the act of adultery. And the emphasis here in the original language is on the words in the act. It's one of those times you really don't want to be arrested. It's one of those times that you really don't want someone to walk in on you. That they've caught this woman in the very act of adultery. And what they say is that the law of Moses says that you're supposed to stone such a woman. What do you say we should do? And here's where they think they've got him. They've been trying all week. And verse 6 says the whole thing is set up to get Jesus to say something where he'll condemn himself. They think that they've got Jesus on what we call the horns of dilemma. The horns of dilemma was this ancient figure in mythology where this bull had these sharp horns, and he would take and catch his victim and on one horn, and then he would toss his head in the air and he would catch the victim on the other horn, and then he would toss him up in the air and he'd catch him on the other horn, and it went back and forth. And that horns of dilemma idea is I'm caught no matter which way I turn. I'm stuck on these horns of dilemma no matter which way I turn. And that's how they think they have Jesus. If he lets her go, then he'll be in line with his teaching about mercy and grace and forgiveness of sins. But he'll be going against the law of Moses. If he says kill her, which will be in line with the law of Moses, then he'll be breaking the Roman law, because only Roman officials are allowed to execute anyone. And so for these men that have drugged this woman and made this public spectacle, adultery is not the issue. They're just using her. In fact, she may have been set up from the very beginning. These men were all in on it, that they probably set this whole scenario up just to catch Jesus. They say that the reason this law, and one of the reasons that you might think that is that the law specifically says that it's not just the woman, but also the man who's supposed to be stoned, who's supposed to die for their sin if they're caught in this situation. Why is the man not here? Probably because he was part of the plot. He may have seduced her to just try to get Jesus to be caught up in his own words. And so here she is. You can imagine her shame, how embarrassed she is by what she's done, the humiliation of everyone looking at her, just an object to be used and gawked at, just someone to be used as a pawn in the religious leaders' plans to get Jesus. She's never allowed to speak in her defense. I mean, you might ask, well, what would she say? She is guilty. She has no excuse. She's soiled, she's dirty, she's given her body to a person, to a guy who at the worst was part of the plot, at best who's left her to die to save himself. The crowd looks at her and says she's cheap, immoral, promiscuous, and basically now everyone knows. And right here is Jesus. His teaching, his credibility, her life is hanging in the balance. And the question becomes, what's Jesus going to do? And what Jesus does is he kneels down, and in essence he says, I think I'll write in the dirt. And that's what he begins to do. And this is the beginning of what Jesus will do to allow her to have a comeback. Ever since the story was first written, ever since the Gospels was written and people repeated this story, probably ever since it first happened, there are people that are wondering what Jesus wrote in the dirt. Some people say he was just scribbling. Some say he was buying time to figure out how to respond to the Pharisees. I don't know that I really buy that. I don't really see the Pharisees stumping the Son of God. But John here gives a couple clues to maybe what he was doing. The first one is the words that he uses for writing. They are a combination of two words which means to write against. The indication here is that whatever Jesus is writing on the ground is on some level accusatory of someone. He's accusing someone of something. He's writing against them. Another idea is that maybe he specifically wrote with one finger in the dirt to acknowledge when God wrote with a finger. He wrote the Ten Commandments. That maybe he was writing the Ten Commandments and the names of the accusers one by one alongside the different Ten Commandments that they had broken. For some people, he wrote down their names beside thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not covet, honor your father and mother, not take the Lord's name in vain. And some people think that he was kneeling down, writing down the sins of those people who were involved in dragging this woman in front of him. that they look down and they see their names, they see their sins. That basically he's making a point here. They're highlighting her sins when their sins need to be highlighted as well. Finally, Jesus stands and he says, okay, stone her. He says, but who's going to throw the first stone? Usually the witness, the one that claims to be a witness of the wrong that's been done, is the person who throws the first stone. But he switches it a little bit and he says, how about the person who has never sinned? How about the one that's never sinned against God? How about they throw the first stone? And then he goes back to the dirt and starts writing again. And all of a sudden, you hear stones start dropping. From the oldest to the youngest person that was standing there. The oldest, who thought they were wise enough to catch Jesus in this trick, to trick him into saying something that would cause him to lose his credibility, to the youngest, who thought maybe that they were the proudest and thought they'll be able to stop Jesus. But all of a sudden they all drop their stones until they've all gone away. They've carried that pride and their plans with them. They recognize that they really have nothing to say at this point. You know, when you read this story, you can't help but know that there's not one of us that hasn't fell for one of Satan's lies at some point. There's not one of us that hasn't given in and allowed ourselves to be tempted and to be drawn to doing something that we shouldn't do. And maybe you've never been caught in the act. But irregardless of whether you have or you haven't, you sinned against God. And you might be the only one that knows, or you might be the one that everyone knows about. Regardless, we need to understand we're not the only ones who ever fell for one of Satan's lies. Satan's good at it. See, Satan's trying to trick us. He's trying to trick us in any way he can. He's telling people, yes, this person really loves you. That's why you need to give in and do what they want. If not, you're going to lose them. He's trying to trick people by saying, you can put the money back before anyone even knows about it. He's trying to trick people by saying just one drink. Everyone's doing it. Or maybe he's trying to trick them by saying, no one has a right to tell you who you can and can't love. Sadly, all of us have fallen from innocence. Doesn't make anything that we do right, but it means that no one does have the right to look down on you, even yourself. Jesus is the only innocent one. He's the only one who could have thrown the first stone, but he didn't. Instead, he allowed this woman to make a comeback. He showed her grace. The accusers disgraced her. The crowd disgraced her. She disgraced herself. But Jesus graced her. He graced her with mercy. When Jesus went back to writing, the accusers went back home. Finally, Jesus stands up, and when he does, there's no one there except for him and the woman. Some people wonder why she didn't run away. Maybe she had nowhere to go. Maybe there was something about Jesus that made her want to stay, that she recognized she was safe there. Jesus asked her, he said, where are your accusers? Is there no one to condemn you? And she says, no one. And Jesus' response is, well, I don't either. And his grace is given to her. Because there's no one to condemn her. Because the one person in the world who could condemn her, the one person in the world that has some reason to condemn her because he is sinless, would rather forgive her than attack her. That's the reason that Jesus told Nicodemus earlier in John when Nicodemus came to meet Jesus. He told him how God loved all the world, that God sent his Son to die for him. But then he said this, he said, God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but to save the world through him, that no one would be condemned. And there's the hope. There's the comeback that we can have. That no one has a right to condemn us. No one has a right to condemn us, but actually, we should love each other instead, because that's what Jesus has done for us. He has offered to show us grace and mercy. Jesus looks at us and He knows we're guilty, but He loves us anyway, and He paid the price so that justice and mercy could live together in us. You know, the whole story leads towards grace. Men wanted to discredit Jesus. Instead, they gave Him a chance to prove His character. The very men who were trying to stop people from coming to Jesus brought this woman to a point where she would meet Him. They wanted to kill her maybe. They wanted to embarrass her. They wanted to ridicule her. They wanted to cause Jesus to make a decision that He couldn't get out of. But none of that happens. And instead, Jesus does the one thing that He can do. He says, I don't condemn you either. And that was half of what this woman needed to hear. And then He tells her the other half of what she needs to hear. He says, leave your life of sin behind. Make a change. Stop breaking God's law. You know, if Jesus hadn't said this, we could have easily come to the wrong conclusion that God doesn't care if we sin, that breaking His law is no big deal. Today we have individuals and churches and denominations who say there's no such thing as objective right and wrong. And they've bought into one of Satan's lies. But we need to understand, we need to be real clear on this. God does not condone sin. If it was wrong 2,000 years ago, it's still wrong today. Jesus asked, you mean there's no one that condemns you? He didn't ask her, was there anyone that condemned her sin? Because basically what Jesus was saying this, I condemn you even as I condemn your sin. See, Jesus didn't say, I don't condemn your sin. He says, I don't condemn you. He didn't say, I don't think what you did was not that big a deal, or the law against adultery was only written because Moses was anti-sex and anti-woman. He didn't say it's okay if you're a consenting adult. No, what He says is, I don't condemn you, but go and sin no more. See, Jesus is calling us to live a life that is pure and holy. If there's sin in our life, it's almost impossible for us to make a comeback if we allow it to continue. It rules over us instead of Jesus. And so for each one of us, it's time to do what Jesus told this woman. It's time for us to know that we can receive the grace that Jesus wants to give us. But that grace isn't a license to sin. God loves us just as we are. But He loves us too much to let us stay that way. And we need to leave our life of sin. It's the only way to really truly know who Jesus is. We need to leave that life even if we never sinned again. We still have sin from our past. We can't erase it. We can't get rid of it. It's always there. But we can come to Jesus and know that He can get rid of it, that He can erase it, that He can give us the promise and the hope of eternal life, that He can remove those dark stains from our life and make us clean. Many times we talk about the fact that Jesus knew what no one else knew. But here's the thing. Today, there may be sins in your life that you think no one else knows about. There may be things that you've kept hidden that will never come out. They'll never see the light of day. There may be things that you say, everyone's forgotten about it. No one even paid any attention. In fact, There may have been a lot of people who justified what you did. But for Jesus, He's the only one that can truly erase it. He's the only one that can really make it go away. He's the only one that can offer forgiveness and grace and mercy. And yet at the same time, say, go and sin no more. Maybe today's the day that you need to make a decision for Jesus. There's a number at the end of this message in which you can call. You can call with that decision you have. Maybe today's the day that you need to turn your life around. You know that you could be that person that if people could see in your heart, they would drag you out in front of everyone. That there would be no reason they didn't drag you just like they did this woman. And so maybe today's the day that, like Jesus, like this woman, Jesus wants to tell you, I do not condemn you. Go and sin no more. If you have a decision to make, I look forward to hearing from you. Until next week, God bless you. Take care. I love you.